You're listening to the Virtual CISO podcast, a frank discussion providing the best information security advice and insights for security, IT, and business leaders. Welcome to the show. Hey there, and welcome to yet another episode of the Virtual CISO podcast. With you, as always, John Verre, your host, and with me today, Mark Montgomery. Hey, Mark.
Hi, John. Thanks for having me.
Oh, listen, I'm looking forward to this conversation, sir. Always like to start easy. Tell us a little bit about who you are and what it is that you do every day.
Thanks. I served 32 years in the Navy, retired as a Rear Admiral about 5 years ago, and went to work for John McCain, really one of the honors of my life, for about 2 years as his policy director. After he passed away, I took a job with a senator I had met during that time, Angus King from Maine. He'd just been selected as chairman of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. I was aware of it because I'd helped pass the legislative package that it was in. And he and Representative Mike Gallagher interviewed me and took me on as the Cyber Solarium Commission executive director. And so from there, I did about 2.5 years with that. It sunsetted, and now I'm running a non-governmental 501c3 to implement the effects of the remaining effects of the Cyber Solarium Commission, and it's housed inside Foundation for Defense of Democracies, where I also serve as a senior fellow on issues like Taiwan, Israel, and missile defense.
So first off, thank you for your service. Second off, I was a John McCain fan. I think he was a true American hero. Whether you agreed with his politics or not, whether you're Republican, whether you're Democrat, he was a good man, and I think he served us well, and I appreciate his service as well. I always ask, what's your drink of choice?
Diet Coke. So I'm gonna disappoint you.
Yeah, I will tell you that I don't drink any diet soda. So yeah, I have nothing to say, and that's rare. Anyone who knows me knows that me having nothing to say is extremely rare. All right, so let's get down to business. So you mentioned the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. In my humble opinion, that report that was published in March of 2020, I believe, is really arguably one of the most influential pieces of information security guidance ever developed. Yet, I would say outside the Washington inner circle, if you will, for lack of a better word, very few people are even aware of it. Can you give us a bit of backstory on how the CSC report came to be, and a little bit about what the report actually says?
Sure. So, as I mentioned, I was working on the Senate Armed Services Committee. The Salarium Commission had been battered around for a few years, but Senator Ben Sasse took it up. He was on the Armed Services Committee. He brought it to John McCain, said, I think we really need this. It was perfect timing because McCain, who could be a bit mercurial, was definitely mad at that moment. He was mad at our inability to influence the cybersecurity of the .gov, our own federal systems, and build the public-private partnership he knew was necessary. The proof to him about this was first the OPM, the Chinese theft of OPM records, 24 million, including his and mine. That bothered him. The really inept response to the North Korean attack on Sony disappointed him. I mean, the idea that the end result was after about 4 months, we finally attributed it and indicted 3 North Koreans. Obviously, none of them were extradited, and in fact, I'm sure they all received medals the next week from Kim Jong-un. But also the reports he'd been getting of Chinese intellectual property theft from the Blair Commission, that kind of put it at hundreds of billions of dollars, rising up to in total $1 trillion of lost GDP through this intellectual property theft. And then at that very moment, the Russian cyber-enabled IO attacks, information operation attacks on our national election infrastructure. You added that up, and he reached his melting point. So we were going to do this commission. And this is where he was really brilliant, and working with Senator Sasse and others, they agreed to put legislators on the commission, and then all 4 corners, that's to say the Senate and House, Republicans and Democrats, eventually picked members from Congress, from the Armed Services Committee. So you had 4 sitting Armed Services Committee members sitting on a commission. That's critical, because fast forward to when we have recommendations, the way you get them implemented is to have congressmen put them over their shoulder and walk them down the aisle, right?
They've got to believe. If they don't believe in it, right? If they don't understand what the rationale is, if they're not committed to it, they're not going to drag it through the
They,
process.
they got to own it.
Yep. Yep.
So, and we'll talk later on about National Cyber Director, but I'll say right now, like, if you'd asked Senator King before the commission started, what do you think about National Cyber Director? He would not have had a good feeling either way about it. By the time we were at the end, he personally had the National Cyber Director provision on it, strapped to his back, taking heavy fire, marching it to conclusion, and that's a significant thing. All the other congressmen helped with that one, but that he's the one who strapped it on his back and took it over the finish line. And so the commission was created. And another thing about McCain, why wait for tomorrow what you can do tonight? He said, I want this report done in less than a year, and I want it ready for use in the NDAA, the fiscal year 21 NDAA. And we met those goals. We went out there, and I got to tell you, starting up a commission, it's a small federal government agency. And let me just tell you words that should not occur in the same sentence: startup and federal government, right? They don't mix well. But we started up a federal agency, and I just had one or two staffers that could just cut through all the BS that makes up the federal government bureaucracy, take care of that stuff for me. I could then hire about 20 thinkers, about half detailees from agencies, about half young, just post-master's degree students of cyber policy and strategy from the best schools who've been studying this, and they've done a little bit of work out in the private sector. Brought those 20 people together and started tackling the issue. They got the report done in 9 months, including getting it through the 14 commissioners, who weren't just the 4 congressmen, but 4 government officials, like Director of the FBI, Deputy Secretary of Defense, and others. And then also 6 private sector experts, either academics, federal government, federal former senior officials, or like CEO of a major energy company, Tom Fanning, things like that. So got it through there, and then another good trick, and I, being a former Senate staffer helped me here. I was just smart enough to know that coming to a Senate staffer and saying, "Hey, we've got 80 recommendations, 50 of them are legislative. Here they are, written down in a PowerPoint." That's not going to work. We handed them 50 written pieces of legislation, and the wherefore, out thou, semicolon, all the stuff that you see legislation written as, by professional legislation writers. Now, look, none of what we wrote is exactly the text that happened. That's great. That's a key to success, is to not get too concerned about that. But we knew, intrinsically, myself and the 4 congressmen knew that we had to write this for the staffs because they're overwhelmed. They're working hard. It wasn't like any of these staffs were taking, excess holidays. They were working hard, and us giving them completed legislation was critical. So we came up with a report, put out in March of 2020. The last event, really, it was March 11th, the last event before Congress kind of shut down from doing external events on March 12th. So had a nice, good rollout. And then throughout the COVID period, just pounded our legislation into the committees for 2 legislative cycles. So through the summer of 20 and the summer of 21, and ended up with about 70% of our legislative recommendations being turned into law over time.
Which is insane. Now, I think, just to kind of frame it for people, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I wrote this down, that the goal of the commission was to develop a consensus on a strategic approach to defending the United States in cyberspace against cyber attacks of significant consequences. Right. So that's what you started with, this idea, and you came up with, if I recall correctly, 80 recommendations across the 6 pillars, and then you said you converted that into 50 literal pieces of legislation. Which I also think what was smart about that was not just helping them do the work, but I would imagine many of these staffers are not cybersecurity experts, right? They come from a political background, legal background. So, they probably felt a little uncomfortable with technical subject matter, cybersecurity subject matter. So I must imagine that was also something that was a great lift for them as well.
Yeah, well, you're exactly right. First, I'd say this on the staff. The Armed Services staff, the Intelligence Community staff, and the Homeland Security staffs have dedicated cyber experts. Mm-hmm. That only leaves 64 other staffs that feel they have a role in cybersecurity that don't necessarily have the dedicated cybersecurity expertise. They do have people, especially in the appropriation staffs, that have become very good at it. But I think those big 3 I mentioned, Homeland Security, Armed Services, and Intelligence, are where the kind of like people who did cyber for living somewhere else in the federal government or in the private sector and then roll into the committee exist. And so that's a very limited footprint, but those people were critical. We would not have been successful without very positive support from the Armed Services, Homeland Security, and Intel committee staffs in both the House and the Senate. And it was stronger in some than others, but still broadly across all 6 of those committees, really helpful.
Gotcha. Can you talk a little bit about the 6 pillars and why you guys organized it into those 6 pillars? Because I thought that was really effective.
That's a great question, because there's 2 ways to look at it, and in the end, we were melding together 2 thoughts. One was kind of from my bureaucratic experience in the military and in the Senate staff. You've got to organize things into edible. You cannot eat an elephant in one bite. So you had to get these things into edible groupings, and so breaking it down into these pillars was critical. The more creative members of my staff would say, well, in reality, we began to think about cyber across these 6 lines of effort. And so when those kind of melded together, we ended up with these 6 pillars under which the different legislative and executive branch recommendations were binned. And it did make it much easier organizationally. And it also allowed you to say to the committee, I have these 3 or 4 just for you, but just so you know, in the same area, here are 2 or 3 others, because they don't like to be, bushwhacked later on with a similar provision in a different committee that they hadn't seen. So I knew that way it helped me keep everyone with good situational awareness. And I think we did a very good job of that in the first year, particularly in COVID conditions where everything was being done by Zoom and phone calls and emails. As I said, we released our report, and the next day, kind of went into lockdown, and the NDA cycle started 3 weeks later. So, again, a lot of credit to Hill staffers. They did not act, particularly the armed services ones, as if COVID had any impact on their legislative writing requirements. They really did produce a fantastic NDAA in the middle of COVID. The 6 pillars that you mentioned, the first one, I think we're one of the ones that we consider most important, and for which I think we probably have the best current grade. We grade ourselves every year, and we will do that for 2 to 3 more years. And overall, we're probably a C right now, but one of the areas I think is above that is organizing the U.S. government. We were not properly organized. We still are not completely properly organized, but we definitely didn't have strategic leadership, at the White House, and we didn't have kind of the quarterback of all the federal agencies, kind of at that, one federal agency that's really leading these efforts, either properly authorized and resourced. So the first thing is the National Cyber Director. That's a strategic leader at the White House. I think that that has evolved. That a job was created by the NDAA. We got it done, and it's taken about a year so far to populate it properly. It's not quite a year yet, but another month or 2. It'll been a year, and it'll eventually be 80 people inside the White House, which is a good, healthy number for coordinating the interagency on a really significant, challenging issue. And you can't have the National Security Council with 5 or 6 people do it. They can do fantastic work. They can't do the kind of the grunt work of organizing 102 federal agencies to kind of be generally pointed in one direction.
Can I ask a quick question there?
Yeah, go
Because
ahead.
I think what you just said, which is amazing to me, and I didn't know this, is that there are now 80 people that work at the White House that are responsible, 80 some odd people that are responsible for helping to establish our cybersecurity posture across the government.
So currently 50, headed
Wow.
to 80, I think within the next 2 to 3 months at the 1 year point. And it could get higher. Frankly, I think legally it could get up with detailees to about 105. And that would be fine. U.S. trade representative offices in the, high 100s, National Drug Control, Office of Science and Technology policies in the low 70s. I mean, you can have some, the appropriate, you can have an effective, you can have an effective leadership organization in the White House if it's properly manned. And then the second element of that was the getting CISO right, the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, Department of Homeland Security, created about now 4 years ago, run first by Chris Krebs and now by Jen Easterly. Chris did a great job focusing it outward, getting it known out in the hinterland, so to speak, i.e. outside the Beltway, and I think did a good job with that. I think internally, whenever you kind of carve, like I said, startup in federal government is bad. having yourself cleaved from a portion of a federal agency and then have to come back and work for them, is a tough thing too. And I guess, we've actually ordered a force structure assessment through Congress that's an idea of how many people do you need for your missions and what type of people do you need. Mm-hmm. I think we're going to find out that CISA needs 50 to 75% more people than they have, the 2,300, 2,500 they have. And a good portion of their current people are not actually properly trained and aligned for the billet they're in. They just happen to have been dropped into it from where they were before the cleaving. So they've got to get the right people with the right numbers and the right billets, and I think they'll be in good shape. But that's going to take years, so we did some authorizations to help that, some appropriations to help that. I think we've done I think we had a total of 10 recommendations for CISA. I think 7 are done so far. They have to do with establishing different organizations within it, authorizing it to do different types of work, particularly like threat hunting, inside the .gov. So really, and then significant appropriations changes. They've gone from about $2 billion to $2.6 billion this year, so about a 30% increase. And then our recommendation for next year is just a shade under $3 billion. I think the growth will slow down there, but if you ask John Katko, who's a pretty experienced congressman on this, he would tell you $5 billion. I think Jen Easterly, Director Easterly, who's probably not allowed to say that out loud, $5 billion, but I think they would support our $3 billion if brought up to Congress to talk to it. So my point on this is strengthening CISA was a big part of that U.S. government work. We also codified the sector risk management agencies, and I can't understate the value in this. This is all those federal agencies that are the partner with the private sector across our 16 critical infrastructures. There was kind of a wild west of how they were organized, and a massive disparity between how Treasury and the financial services work and energy works, and then which is I'm sure there's a complaint about too much regulation, but in terms of that support and interaction and discussion, there's a lot of it. And then down at water, where EPA has literally 2 people running this sector management in cybersecurity for 52,000 drinking water utilities and 10 or 12,000 wastewater. You're not doing oversight. When you have 2 people watching 52,000, you're doing like website management, and that's a big deal. So you had this disparity. So we said, hey, here are the rules for being a sector risk management agency. You need to do these 6 tasks. 1 or 2 of them you can be helped by CISA, but the vast majority of them are core issues for you. And I think that's important because we need to hold federal agencies accountable for their role in this. So we can't just because in the absence of this, people go, well, let CISA do it. Well, the problem with that is CISA already has like 7 number 1 priorities. You don't want to add in, and by the way, manage the water sector, because these guys who otherwise manage water pretty well. There's a lot of lead pipe work going on, tens of billions of dollars being spent making our water and air more safe and secure. They can do the cybersecurity if they want to. They just hadn't prioritized it. They're starting to now because I think to some degree we've embarrassed them. But that sector risk management agency stuff was important. A second pillar was norms, and this is norms and standards. And here this is an incomplete grade right now. We got some minor things like more cyber law enforcement. So we've done a few things here. We've got more cyber law enforcement attaches at embassies. We've got improved sanctions for China doing cyber events, cyber malicious activity. But we have not done the big things. One is the Cyber Diplomacy Act, establishing an assistant secretary level ambassador at State Department, reorganize the State Department to kind of get out of the Byzantine structure they're in and get into cyber management from the top down of here's how we're going to get ready. Where is this really important? We're getting our butts kicked at international standard setting organizations where the Chinese and the Russians are rolling in with a sovereignty based state-owned enterprise view, no accounting for personal rights or human rights, in comparison to our traditional push for transparency in a rules-based system. And we had abdicated our role there as a government, and we weren't supporting the private sector and those standards making bodies that they were involved in, as the Chinese and Russians did for their companies. So we passed some. We've suggested some provisions on that. That stuff is in the innovation bill, which used to be called the China bill or the CHIPS Act or the Competes Act or USICA. It's now being conferenced under the name the Bipartisan Innovation Act. If our standard stuff gets passed in there, we'll really have made a big change. But that's an incomplete because it hasn't happened yet. I got a couple more
Yeah,
pillars, if
please.
that's okay. Uh, the military one was pretty straightforward. We came up with 12 military recommendations, handed them to the Senate Armed Services Committee. They put all 12 in. There's like, I won't say there's minimal thought, but we were in total, we'd been working with them very closely, and that was good. But one of the biggest ones is the National Mission Force, kind of our on-net operators. We really rely on them to do cost imposition on Russia, China, North Korea, Iran. The size of it was set in 2013 by a 2012 assessment of the threat. Well, now it's at this point 2021 when we were doing this 2020, 2021. We needed a new force structure assessment of the National Mission Force. How many people do we need? We think the number is probably 40 to 50% higher over the 12,000 people they have right now. Excuse me, the 6,000 people they have right now on these on-net operators, and 40 to 50 or even 60% increase in that. I think they'll come out with a slightly lower number. They would have never really gotten started on it, in my opinion, without congressional push, because it's very hard to convince the services to give up bodies to this, because it means less people on ships or aircraft or Army battalions. So the Army, Navy, and Air Force would have pushed back against this. But we helped Cybercom by creating some working space, and he's already asked for about a 10% increase over the last two fiscal year budgets. So that's a good sign that we're making some headway there. There's some other ones on making sure cybersecurity is in your weapon systems, in the nuclear command and control system, and that you're properly doing the assessments of that. So I'm pretty excited about the military stuff. I'd give that an A, on getting it done and getting implemented. One of our best pillars. And there's a couple more pillars, but one last one I'll talk about right now is resilience. Here we did a pretty good job. Again, we recommended something called continuity of the economy planning. That's the idea that, like, hey, we're good. Like, if there's a significant attack on the United States, cyber or otherwise, we have continuity of government, continuity of operations, but we haven't thought about how you recover the economy. And a lot of people just say, don't worry, FEMA does that. And they absolutely do for like a storm that hits one state, except they're not recovering the economy. They're recovering public health and safety. So they get water down there, tents down there, food down there. They get diesel generators up to the hospitals. But when the Northeast power grid goes down, we don't need FEMA bringing, well, they do need to bring some water and tents in, but in reality, what would they need them to do? We need the federal government to run a prioritized restoration of our infrastructure to ensure that we can rapidly restore our economic vitality. So when you think about the Northeast, returning the exchanges, that are run out of New York City, the commodities, over the counter, all the different exchanges that are run there, you have to bring them back, which means you have to integrate the telecom, power, water coming back so these services can go back online in just a day or two of loss. Because if every day they're down, you're going to lose, maybe 100 billion or more in lost GDP opportunity. That adds up fast. And then you lose your credibility for running these exchanges, when international competitors want to run some of them. So I think it's very important that we have a plan for how we restore ourselves, not just the electrical power grid, but the whole integrated structure. That's called continuity of the economy planning. Congress directed, we recommended it, and Congress directed the administration to do it. They've been a little slow on that. That's one where they had 2 years to work on it, and I think they took the first 15 months kind of like admiring the problem. Now with 9 months to go, they're working on it. I suspect with only a 9-month job, we'll get a plan for a plan. And Washington's famous for this. We need a plan. We'll come up with a plan for the plan.
But you're one step closer, though. I mean, we're one plan down, one to go. I mean, that's not bad. You got. Sometimes just a little bit of progress, Mark, is enough, right?
Yeah, I'm afraid that we're going to end up with a framework for a plan, and then I'll be like, "Geez, we really, I could have done that. I could have, my son and
Yeah,
I
you,
could have
you
went
you
that
could
route
argue
out."
that
But
with the CSC report was a framework for a plan, right? So they really didn't move anything
it
forward.
was, yeah, they already
Exactly.
had that. Yeah,
It's-
that's a great point. So, look, across six pillars, we had mixed results, and I want to be clear. If we were taking an actual grade at my son's university, we'd probably have a D, maybe a C. Now, I will tell you historically, commissions
Mhm.
get Fs. They get 10 to 15% of their things done. We got a really high number, and I attribute that, not totally, but really, really significantly to the four congressional commissioners, Senators King and Sass, and Representatives Gallagher and Jim Langevin. I'll just say this real quick. Jim Langevin, by far, the most cyber proficient legislator we've had in decades. The only one comparable was Will Hurd, who resigned about a term ago, a Republican from Texas. Jim Langevin, a Democrat from Rhode Island, has been a leader of unparalleled knowledge and success. He also gets things. He's a brutish, legislator. When he decides he wants something done, it happens. He's built up the relations. He knows how to get things done. He knows where the skeletons are. However you want to, attribute it. When he wants to get something done, it gets done. So I give him a lot of credit for the success of it.
So, like I said, I think the report has been remarkably successful. I mean, because if you just look at what's going on in the U.S. government, right, in the past, let's say 2 years, right, we've got CMMC, right, we've got the DOJ putting together their civil cyber fraud initiative, which is an enforcement mechanism that's being used not only for CMMC but across other government regulation, government guidance. The presidential executive order, right, was I think very significant. Whatever that was, 14027. Within there, right, you really started to see like the concept of the secure software development framework come to fruition, zero trust initiatives. You've got the IoT labeling idea that came out of that. Maybe I think it was the FTC they were guiding to produce that. They asked NIST to create the guidance for it. I mean, I just think you've seen a ton now from my perspective, looking at the six pillars, a lot of those to me feel like might fit into the where is it? The operationalized cybersecurity collaboration with the private sector, right? Because these are all things you're saying to, hey, you're an IoT manufacturer. Hey, you're a member of the defense industrial base. Hey, you're a member, you're an entity in one of the 17, 16, whatever it is, critical cyber sectors, and CISA's guidance. I mean, so from my perspective, that's where I see huge value. And I agree with you that we don't want more regulation in life, but isn't regulation necessary? Because if we don't have a good public-private partnership, and if we're both not secure on both sides of the equation, I mean, isn't literally our sovereignty and our economy at just in extreme peril?
So that's a great description of the executive branches. Look, I think the executive branch did a great job. They grabbed some of our ideas, grabbed their own ideas, but the principles that we were putting forward, I think, broadly have been carried out by the administration over the last 15 months. And you're exactly right. It's in two of the pillars: the building, the public-private collaboration, and in developing a more secure cyber ecosystem. And the reason, and one really applies to those critical infrastructures, the ones that are the public-private collaboration is about like Dominion power and things like that. The ecosystem's about Vicks dry cleaner, right? You want everyone to be, so in one of them you're trying to like very carefully ensure that the critical infrastructure is identified and properly protected for our national security, economic stability, public health, and safety. And the other one, you're trying to raise everyone's security so we're less vulnerable to adversaries, whether they be nation states or criminal actors. And so in that public-private collaboration, I do think the biggest thing left on the table right now is something we call systemically important critical infrastructure. But it's basically what are those kind of most important, we'll say 120 to 150 companies that, that facilitate national security, the movement of our troops, the transportation, power, water that allow our troops to move to their jump off points wherever they're going, that facilitate our economic security, the telecommunications, financial services, and electrical power that allow us to continue to run the world's largest economy and rapidly recover from and restore following a significant event. And then the third element is, the public health and safety. Those companies that really are important. So big water, big power, big hospital systems. Those 120 and 150 have to maintain a certain standard. You can call it a regulation, you can call it a standard. We need to say there's a floor for those. And if that floor is already set by your regulation, by the SEC or the FDIC or some other financial group, or by FERC, in the energy world, whoever, or the NRC, if you have nuclear power plants, great, you already meet it. We do want to have third-party assessments of that. If it's already being done by your regular, great. If not, we've got to have a system set up for that. We need to have really quick incident reporting, not the stuff that they debated and passed, last year of 48 or 72 hours, but really quick. Like, we're seeing these things. You don't have to attribute it. It's going to be protected under liability when you give it to us. It's not going to go right to law enforcement or anything like that. It's going to allow us to get a hint that, hey, 7 electrical power grid generation companies are experiencing the same attack at the same time, or 3 banks saw this. You can see a campaign being run against you. So that's the commitments from the companies. Better, a floor of security, third-party checked, incident reporting. But in return, you're going to get improved access to classified information, improved an ability to help establish what our intelligence collection methods are. You may have specific, unique infrastructure networks that the intelligence community wouldn't normally collect, seeing if an adversary is working them. But you could ask for that. And in addition, you're going to get some liability protection. If you meet a floor we set, and you're attacked by a foreign adversary because you're a critical infrastructure of the U.S., you're going to get some and you've met the third-party check, and we're going to have to give you some liability protection against loss of business operations. Just like we would if Russia took you out with a cruise missile, no one would think twice about some liability protection. But suddenly you say it's a Russian cyber attack, like, well, I don't know. Why didn't you go counterattack? Well, we don't want you doing that. Just like we don't want you building your own, cruise missile defense systems around your station. I don't want to fly in a Southwest flight if you're gonna, start launching cruise missiles at what you think are Russia. You know what I mean? So we've got to be realistic about this. That's systemically important critical infrastructure. Everyone has to. We always say cybersecurity. We generally say it's a nonpartisan issue. When you start throwing around words like regulation, security standards, third-party checks, liability, it gets a little less nonpartisan. But if we have a comprehensive deal where everyone's giving up a little to get a better process, to get that end result that we know we need, to meet Chris Inglis, he says to beat one of us, you got to beat all of us. That's the idea, that you got to have this public-private collaboration that works. We're not going to get there without some sicky legislation. This is not something you can executive order into existence, that kind of liability protection. This is something that's got to stand up in court. You're going to need a law, and we're going to need to pass that. To me, that's the biggest thing we could do this year. So I kind of hang my hat on that. I do think there's lesser things being done in the public-private collaboration, the Joint Collaborative Environment, which is a better information sharing. It's part of the SICI, but it's the information sharing infrastructure. I think Jim Langevin is going to push that through this year. And in that thing I talked about, the cyber ecosystem, so good stuff's happened. I support what Chairman Gensler at the SEC is pushing for good, cyber good governance requirements in publicly traded companies, that they have to report, who's on their board, what they're doing to mitigate risk. I think that's important. I think that gets at the spirit of our Sarbanes-Oxley recommendations that we had in the commission. So bottom line is there's work to do, but that's systemically important critical infrastructure.
Yeah, so a couple of those ideas I really like. So the NACD a few years ago came out with the same recommendation, that boards have to have that. So I do think some level of encouragement is a good thing. And I also like the idea that the government's taking a little bit of a carrot and a little bit of a stick approach. The carrot is, there's value to you doing this, and you're going to get a little bit back out of it. And the stick is, if you don't, we've got mechanisms of making life a little uncomfortable for you, as an example, through false claims acts and things of that nature. Just out of curiosity, and you might not want to comment on this. So with the DoD taking a step back with CMMC, right, and taking a more straight NIST-based approach and taking a more basic rulemaking process, right? CFR 32, if you believe what Stacy Boschanek is saying, is probably hits in March of 2023. In theory, if CFR 32, that would protect all types of CUI, which are a lot of the critical infrastructure, a lot of the people that you're covering talked about. In theory, we've already now have the regulation that goes into almost every contract that flows that. Are you guys, I mean, is there a position within CSC or within the entities that are doing this, towards following on to CMMC and NIST 800-171 and the existing CUI protection mechanisms? Is the idea of promoting a new mechanism, or is that not something you either want to talk about or you don't know the answer to right now?
So I appreciate what they're doing in CMMC, and I think they're stepping off in the right direction now. And so I'd say first I do support that. Um, I do worry that with so many people, there's a risk of this kind of like defaulting into
Hmm.
checklist management, vice having iterative assessments going on. I think we do have to over time figure out how we get ourselves. It's got to be a handshake that we're allowed to run, either a third party running unqueued, pen testing, or some unqueued assessments of your systems. Um, we eventually have to get to that where threat hunting is allowed
Okay.
throughout the DIB by something, whether it's DoD or not. And we recommended that in our commission report. I know DoD owes a report to that to Congress, but I recognize, you know, CMMC is a pretty big elephant. You got to eat this a couple bites at a time. So probably what they're heading for next March is about right. But the threat hunting
Hmm.
can't be far behind. I just don't think management by it's more than management by checklist. I don't want to be unfair, but something that's
Yeah,
broadly
but
compliance checks
yeah,
are
it's
is going to be
it is the
tough.
proverbial catch 22, right? Because anytime audit by its nature is comparison to a standard. So anytime you create a standard, you effectively have a checklist, and then you get a compliance
Yeah.
mentality approach versus security mentality approach, right? So finding that right balance. I mean, if the standard is good and you actually truly are compliant, you're probably secure. That's not saying you are. So I think what you're advocating is more, some type of mechanism by which there is an ability to validate in an unscheduled way that the security systems are working as
Yeah.
intended, correct?
And that is what we recommended in our thing, and it and came into, but in the way it turned into law was DoD had a year to think about it. They're a little
Well,
overdue on
that's
that
not
report. I think it's
that's
coming in.
not an, look. I mean,
Um,
I agree with you, and I think you're talking about sort of a holy grail. But I do think that that is going to be no. You look. I mean, you guys knew when you made that recommendation. Like, I mean, you're trying to get them to sprint. Like when you were just past walking or jogging, right? I mean, so it's not an
yeah.
easy one.
No, I'm with you. As
Yeah.
I said, that's not the
All right.
March 2023 deadline. And on top of it, the one that makes me, smirk a little bit is bring that over to the .gov. We need to eventually. The .gov needs to get to the right standards for these things. The non-DoD federal agencies. But I think they could learn a lot from watching DoD go through these growing pains, and then figure out how to bring it over. And I think that's a great job for the National Cyber Director. He needs to look at it strategically, get the timing right, and then work with his deputy, who's also he's a dual-hatted deputy, who's the CISO for the federal government, Chris DeRusha, and then Jen Easterly, and say to the two of them, all right, how do we begin to implement this, along with the other work they're doing, and they're doing a fantastic. You mentioned
Oh,
some of it, the zero
I'm
trust
amazed.
architecture.
The amount of
They
progress
are
that we've
working
seen in
together
the
great.
last 2 years is remarkable relative to what I saw in the last
Yeah.
20 years of doing this.
And the budget numbers really are bigger. And we write every time
Hmm.
they put out a budget, we hammer it. But we start it by saying there's a lot of really good stuff in here. We give at least two paragraphs of good stuff, then spend 8 paragraphs explaining what they could have done better. Because Congress we then try to turn that into congressional language to get Congress to plus it up. And I have to tell you, Congress did a fantastic job last time. I mean, they took the president increased CISA's budget 5%, Congress increased it 25%. And that 20% was meaningful things that will make CISA a more effective agency. And that same effort is repeated across numerous federal agencies as the Congress gets more involved in the.
Well, I mean, and look, they wake up every morning and there's something. I mean, we're now to a point, right, where I mean, they're getting it, right? Even the guys that, like you said, are a little bit old in the tooth, been in Congress a long time, not necessarily the most technically proficient. I mean, you can't hide from what's going on every single day. So it's good that they're giving these people the money that's necessary for us to be secure. I apologize for this. I said a lot of people don't know what you guys are doing, and then I was surprised when I went to the CSC website and I was not aware that you'd released 5 white papers since the report. Are those intended to support, provide additional guidance on addressing the recommendations you already made? Do they cover new ground?
So they're a mix. So one of them was a national cyber director, a very specific one. We were asked, and that one's not posted. We provided back to Congress. It was very specific. Here's what we plan to do. Here's how we would implement this. They said, look, your 2 paragraphs in the report were great. Your legislation's great. We need like 10 to 15 pages explaining how the job works before we embrace your legislation. So we did that, and obviously was successful as we got the NCD passed. Another one was on pandemic. What could you learn from the first year of response to the pandemic? And the answer was particularly about leadership. I mean, it's not hard to recognize that our failure to have a strategic leader at the White House on COVID slowed and complicated our response. And so, we were able to show similarities with cyber that you can then show how the NCD could have helped. So I think it really helped on that. And then we also said, hey, here are a few things that studying COVID we didn't think about. Now that we've had COVID, and we think about cyber, and it had a little bit had to do with what happens when you start to telework the whole federal government. And there were some lessons we had there for security. And then the other big one was disinformation. The amount of disinformation flowing, particularly foreign disinformation, Chinese about, origins and things, it's originated out of Fort Detrick or whatever it was, but also just, other Russian disinformation about a few things. Bottom line was that, hey, we gotta, at this kind of time, we have to be really attuned to foreign disinformation and make sure that we've set up, and the government is not we said very explicitly, the government should not be the arbiter of truth. So I guess we wouldn't have been the biggest fan of if you'd asked us at that moment, of a disinformation board. And that's apolitical. That was, Republicans and Democrats, they weren't looking to be that. But we said someone needs to do that. And so that the government should support NGOs that do that. So we probably had a middle ground between what each side's thinking about now on that. But we had some good disinformation content in there. The other 3 white papers were on issues that we'd explored during the report, but had not fully developed. And there's about 8 or 9 of those issues. 3 of them we got white papers done on. One was supply chain, and that ended up with about 12 more recommendations, a handful of which have been done, and a handful more in this innovation bill, and a handful more we'd like to get done. And another was on cyber workforce. And I had to tell you, I just stopped there and say, we're continuing to work workforce in our next iteration, and I'll probably mention that later. But I'll just say, it is so disappointing that you can read a federal cyber security workforce policy paper from 23 years ago. It identifies 10 problems. 7 of those problems still exist exactly the same way. I mean, very few people think that a grade of 30 after 23 years of effort is, redeeming.
That gets you the Hall of Fame. Yeah.
It would be okay. But I mean, it's just, I have to tell you, there's then workforce studies from 2010 and 2015 that, from those, we've probably only gotten 1 or 2 things done. It is, it's not okay that the federal government has not been able, particularly in the .gov, to solve its cybersecurity workforce challenge. It's mandate, like the public sector, the companies, it's mandate 2/3. Roughly speaking. And when you're manned at 2/3, it means you're probably not getting the job done. But your people are unhappy while they do it. And kind of most importantly for cyber, unlike almost any other skill set, the requirement for recurring frequent training is significant. You need to go get certifications and training every 24 to 36 months. Let me tell you, if you're manned at 2/3, the last thing leaders are thinking of doing is saying, hey, I'd like to send half of my 2/3 of guys and gals to go get some training and lose them, right? So you have this problem where you have an underperforming, unhappy, untrained, or poorly trained cybersecurity workforce shockingly, that doesn't lead to high retention.
Well, when the government figures it out, they can share that with the private sector because I can't listen. We all love bashing the government, and saying they don't spend our tax dollars as much smart as we'd like them to be. That's one place I feel bad for them, because I mean we see the same thing. I think I go into any organization I go into, they're undermanned. So the government's not alone there, unfortunately. Yeah. So here's an interesting question for you. The CSC's mandate ended in 2021, if I'm not mistaken. And now the CSC2, right, is picking up this effort. Um, so a couple things there. So I guess the first one to ask is, in addition to following on to the original report, right, there are five new areas of focus that you guys are driving into. Can you talk a bit about those and why those specific five areas of focus?
Sure. So, yeah, we did sunset at the end of December, and Senator King thought about it, and Representative Langer, they talked, and it's the right thing to do. We need to end that commission in case there's a reason for another cyber commission for some reason. You want to be clear of the battlefield. But they knew we had at least 2 more years of implementation work left on the existing legislation and on the handful of things we knew we were still working. And so they said, let's go ahead and set up a NGO. I ended up setting up a Foundation for Defense of Democracies, no foreign government kind of think tank. It has no foreign government funds, so it was perfect for legislators working with it. And it has and set up the NGO there so that I have a small staff, because most of my staff is now working at National Cyber Director, or CISA, or on the Capitol Hill, where they can bring the expertise they got in the commission right back in the government, and that's fantastic. They got one just at Treasury, so really like that. Hired some new staff, and we started to tackle. And the issues, you said 5 issues, is exactly what we're doing. The first thing we're doing is supporting the legislation that's left over. Second thing we're doing is that annual assessment I mentioned. And then we're looking at some topics. The water cybersecurity worries, as I mentioned it earlier. It's that we're in a position now where the cybersecurity has industry concerned so much. They're like asking to regulate, or at least have set up standard setting bodies. Like, in the absence of EPA guidance, can we just get that? They're asking Congress to take action. And, EPA have to be involved in it, but I mean, that's a weird thing when industry's kind of leading the call for setting up a standard setting organization. But we're studying that water, trying to figure out what are the right provisions to both get EPA healthy, but also to immediately begin to attack the cybersecurity of the water sector, which I think is something along the lines of an industry-led, government oversighted, mandatory, standard-setted body. And then that's the first issue, water. The second issue is workforce. We're working that federal workforce because we didn't come up with legislative proposals in our white paper. This time we did, and we've got them. And they involve things like having a cyber accepted service, which means going to mean better pay for cybersecurity workers and better job descriptions. We also are trying to get better data on the cybersecurity workforce, and we're trying to set up. I hope we'll try to set up a cybersecurity. A development institute where, a remote learning institute run by the federal government for federal employees to get them their certifications and move them along more quickly as they get the workforce experience. That's the second one. The third one is the continuity of the economy I mentioned. We're trying to help a little bit with that by getting some policy papers done, like the framework for a plan. As I mentioned, we'll probably try to get that out. Maybe we'll do the plan for a plan. I don't know if we're going to have that much bandwidth. We're also looking at space, whether it should be a critical infrastructure, and aviation cybersecurity within that. So we're taking a look at that issue, and we're taking a look at maritime transportation security. It's one of those weird ones. It was a tough Christmas, right, with the ships backed up at Long Beach and Charleston. Just think how it could have been worse, which is a cybersecurity attack on our sea points of departure, our major civilian ports. All those gantries and cranes are operated by position, navigation, timing circuit. They're very cyber vulnerable. And so we've got real questions about that and about some of the other elements of the maritime transportation security infrastructure. So we'll be working on that. So that's a bunch of issues that we're working over the next, I think, 2 years, along with those assessments and getting legislation done. I think, obviously Senator King gets the final vote, but I think 2 more years from this past January is probably how long we'll
Gotcha.
take this
Now,
out.
in looking at that, they're very consistent with what you talked about earlier, right? Like some of these critical areas that are, uh, some of them though are covered technically by CISA, right? They're critical infrastructure sectors, right? Like water, wastewater, the healthcare sector, maybe not maritime transportation specifically, but transportation.
No, those
Right.
are all sectors. MTS is covered
Okay.
by the Coast Guard and the DHS. Water is covered by EPA.
Right now, I noticed
Space
that.
isn't one.
It's funny.
That's
Well,
interesting to me.
if you saw my
Yeah,
eyes moving, I literally was looking up the 16
yeah.
critical infrastructure and going, I don't think space is on there. Which is interesting. Okay. So here's an interesting question for you. So, the Cyber Solarium Commission was commissioned by the government, right? Now you guys are part of a 501c3, right? The Foundation for the Defense of
Yeah.
Democracies, right? Is now
Mhm.
driving this. Um, Now that you're no longer a government commission, will CSC2 still have the same sway, the same influence that CSC did?
Yeah. So we'll see. It depends. First of all, it's definitely being driven by Senator King and
Hmm.
Representative
Hmm.
Gallagher, the two chairmen, still. And I think Representative Langevin and Senator Sass have a big push on it too, as do the other former commissioners, Suzanne Spalding, Samantha Ravitch, Tom Fanning, Patrick Murphy, and Frank Salifo. So those kind of 9 people are moving us. That's who's moving us. And the question is, particularly the 4 congressmen, to what degree do they stay involved? If they stay involved,
Okay.
we'll have sway. If they don't stay involved, we won't. It's as simple as we only had sway
Hmm.
because of them. There's tons of federal commissions out there that produce a doorstop, and wedge the door open just fine. And there's tons of things that aren't handled by commissions that get done because they have motivated congressmen pushing them. If we have motivated congressmen pushing them, what we provide is a a staff of reasonably intelligent cybersecurity people to help push things through, and tons of support. One thing about CSC, and I'm still seeing it now, is people reach out to us and they still can, and we will provide. We listen to them. If it's appropriate, we get them, talks with some of our commissioners. If it's not appropriate, if we can get it and understand it, get the information and get it to the commissioners, it's valuable. 50% of the ideas we had were stolen. Minimum. That's low. 75% of the ideas we had were stolen. I mean, if this had been a PhD thesis, the CSC 2.0 report would have been embargoed and stripped, thrown out of the
Well, there are. Well, I
academia,
mean, what's the
the
old adage
academy.
there? There are no ideas, only recycled ones. I mean, so I mean, there
Yeah,
you're just building on
yeah,
somebody else's shoulders. Hey, listen, I don't give a crap how you
that's right.
got there. I just like the fact that we're actually seeing some movement.
Yep, I agree, I'd also say there's people like Senator Peters, Senator Rounds, Senator Portman, Congressman Katko and Yvette Clark in the House. If we had not had those leaders moving these issues beyond our congressmen, we wouldn't
Well,
get anywhere.
all good stuff, and my thanks to them. So this next question I have for you is like a couple of our guys that are very active in federal defense industrial based stuff specifically said, please ask him this, right? So it's around the threat intelligence programs. So I know, you guys did a good job with, that whole information sharing and threat intelligence sharing. They were asking, does this look like it's going to expand beyond DFARS 7012, 72-hour cyber incident reporting requirements? Do you think it's going to go beyond the DIB?
So, yes, I think on expanding beyond the 72 hour, we'll have
Mm-hmm.
to see the report we get back. I hope it's yes
Because
beyond
72,
extending beyond the
72 is
72
kind of,
hour
I
requirement.
know
I
it's
hope it,
hard to know when you have an incident, but the sooner that you get that information
yeah,
out there, the better it is for
yeah.
the community as a whole.
Since I know they take much more than
I
72 hours
know.
to determine they had an incident, I'll just say it should affect that. I don't think it'll go outside the DIB. Look, we're asking DoD to comment on this, that they would refuse to comment on anything outside the DIB. I think they'd keep it inside the DIB. I know that's not a perfect answer, and we're still waiting on responses from DoD. And that DoD is late on every report. I mean, I don't think they've ever been on time. On a report I've asked for, and I've probably asked for 50 to 100 as a Senate staffer. They've sometimes been close. They're never early. They're almost always late, and these are
And
getting
then
very
their
late.
second question was, any new information on how federal agencies will incentivize prime contractors to, quote unquote, disclose their subcontractors to DoD?
Yeah. I don't know. I don't think that would be the use of incentivize as a positive term.
So you're saying
You know,
this is definitely a stick, not a
incentivize
carrot,
sounds
I
so
think is what
positive.
you're saying.
Yeah, that's I will say this. I'll go out on a limb and say it's a stick incentive, not a carrot incentive. How's that?
Yeah, but it does tie to what you were talking about earlier, right? That the idea of really understanding your supply chain, right, and securing the supply chain. So, anything we
Yeah.
missed? We beat this up pretty good. Anything we missed? Anything else you think we should cover?
No, you got it. I appreciate. Look, let's be clear. We benefit from
Hmm.
hearing from people, and I talk any CISO group that ever wants to talk to me. I talk to them because I know that's the heart of this issue. I'm at Mark at
Hmm.
cyberssolarium.org. And the advantage of being a very small organization, you can have your first name as the title, and then we're at www.cybersolarium.org, and we're building up a new website as we take that over. You can see all our products on there, and I was given the right to bring over the CSC's products as well. So everything's loaded there if you want access to it, and you can certainly see all our legislative requirements. But I certainly appreciate everyone's support, and will always entertain talks with people who have ideas or products or thoughts on how to do better.
You told me you're prepared, so we're gonna go for it. So give me a fictional character or real world person you think would make an amazing or horrible CISO, and why.
Well, a horrible CISO would be Barney Fife because you can't keep that bullet.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
seeing you
I
in me
shouldn't be
here, I
laughing because
know,
I
but
have no idea what you're talking about.
yeah,
Yeah, sadly, I
yeah,
do.
that's right. Yeah, yeah. You can't keep that bullet in the pocket. You know what I mean? The CISO's got to be someone who's out front leading. And I'm not saying you should shoot people on the job, but I'm saying that you should be out there leading from the front. And
And Don
that wasn't
Knotts
Barney
very
Fife.
much appreciates the fact
Don
that you
Knotts, yeah.
acknowledged him. I think he died a few years. I think I remember seeing that he
That's,
died a couple of years ago. Yeah,
I think with
exactly.
Abe
Fish
Vigoda.
from Barney Miller. That was a great TV show, by the way. I mean, if you go back in time, Hal Linden was great. Anyway, so listen, this was fun.
Yeah.
I appreciate it. I also want to very sincerely say thank you to you and the entire commission for your service. I think that what you guys did was extremely important, and I think that it will pay dividends for us as a nation for many years. So much appreciated, and best of luck with the new stuff. And if by chance I could ever be of help, please don't hesitate to reach out.